I'm Thalie Martini, CEO of Breast Cancer UK, and welcome to the Be Well podcast. Today, I'm talking to a registered nutritionist, health writer, and author who specialises in the menopause. When my guest started experiencing perimenopausal symptoms, she couldn't find any solid and evidence-based nutrition advice anywhere, and this was long before menopause was hitting the headlines. So she actually decided she would become the go-to source for reliable and actionable information that works. Now, today, she is a leading voice in the positive menopause movement. Quite simply, she wants the menopause transition to be celebrated, not feared. So she's a published author and a menopause educator running clinics and workshops for individuals and also goes to workplaces. And with the growing meno market, which frankly can be daunting and confusing for most women, she has a refreshingly no-nonsense approach, which includes no preaching, no judging, no fads, and no pseudoscience. That's music to my ears. Her book, The Perimenopause Solution, which she co-authored with Dr. Shazadi Harper, who is a medical doctor and specialises in women's health. This book offers readers 2 expert consultations all in one. And it aims to help women not only to survive the journey into menopause, but to thrive. So that's a really positive thing, particularly also as someone who is herself in that life stage. I'm really, really looking forward to our chat. I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome Emma Bardwell to our podcast.
Thalie, thank you so much. What an intro. Barely recognise myself.
Well, you know, it really is impressive, your whole story. And it would be lovely, Emma, if you could start with telling us your story. What is it that led you to where you are today?
Yeah, so you've kind of tapped into it already to a degree. It was essentially, I was going through perimenopause. I wasn't getting the support that I felt I needed. And so I had to do my own research, which I know a lot of women listening, will relate to. And on the back of that, I decided to kind of bridge this gap because I was seeing this kind of huge disparity between, basically there's this big kind of gap in terms of women's health. So women just weren't getting evidence-based information. There was, when things aren't very clear, I think there's a lot of room for this pseudoscience that you spoke about. There's a lot of kind of woo-woo stuff going on. And I really wanted to cut through that confusion for women because it's an overwhelming time anyway. And I just felt that women deserved more. So basically my book, my social media, all the the workshops that I do is essentially based around, getting this evidence-based info that is practical to women that they can put into place easily.
And, I suppose back then, not that long ago, but, fairly long ago before it all became a massive market, which we can talk about in a minute, I suppose a lot of women were getting kind of information from their mothers, their grandmothers, and it was all something that we, I suppose, felt was something we would rather avoid than actually face head on. And the other thing also is that this whole notion of hormones and how that impacts on our menopause. And it's a pretty complex thing, isn't it? The role that hormones play in our female health. One example we talk about is that changes in hormone have a massive impact, for example, on our breast cancer risk. Now, you talk about hormones and how important it is for women to take control of their hormones before they take control of you. So as I said, that sounds a bit complex, but can you explain what you mean by that?
So yeah, the book, essentially, The Perimenopause Solution, was written with a kind of idea that women would be reading it before they feel like their hormones are falling off a cliff. And I think for lots of people who are experiencing really debilitating symptoms, it's because they weren't prepared for what was inevitably going to happen, because it happens to all of us. Menopause isn't something that we can avoid, but it definitely is something that can be a bit more positive, I think, than we have been led to believe. So the tone of the book, we really wanted it to be incredibly positive. And the kind of mantra that I always have going around my head, particularly when it comes to perimenopause, is be prepared, not scared, because I think there is a lot of negative kind of press, I think, are my mum particularly, she didn't talk about it at all. It's shrouded in lots of secrecy, lots of stigma, a fair bit of shame, which we are chipping away at. I think now, 2025, things are looking very different in the menopause sphere. But, when I was going through it, so I'm 53, I started going through perimenopause about the age of 42. So in those 10 years, a lot has changed. And I was categorically told by my GP, that I couldn't be perimenopausal because I was too young. And we now know, that isn't true at all. So, yeah, essentially what I would like women to do is to kind of gather as much information, as much evidence-based information as possible so that they can feel like they are in control. And menopause isn't driving, let's say, and they're not this kind of passenger, but actually that they can navigate how they want this next part of their life to look.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you describe it that way, because I do think, when I think about my mother and my grandmother, it was very much passengers on this kind of inevitable train to a nightmare. So I think we need to wind back a little bit and not make assumptions. I think a lot of women have heard the term perimenopause, but maybe they don't really know what it is. And you said you entered perimenopause at 42. How did you know? What were the symptoms? And how do women know that they're in perimenopause?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think a lot of the time women don't know, and that's the issue. So we now kind of talk about it as the menopause transition. So menopause itself is just one day. It's your final period. If you look back 12 months, it was 12 months since your last period. Perimenopause is the time leading up to that. And for lots of women, that can be the most kind of turbulent time. So it's a time when your hormones, they're not declining really nicely. They're kind of in this huge state of flux. It's like a hormonal chaos almost. And because of that, women can experience this huge spectrum of symptoms. And I think we don't kind of realise quite what a huge role our hormones play in our health, our day-to-day health. So we often think purely of those sex hormones, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, but actually we're talking about 50 plus hormones, cortisol, oxytocin, lots of neurotransmitters as well. So for me, it was essentially, I've lost my train of thought. Sorry.
How you knew you were in perimenopause? Okay,
so yeah, we have touched on this already, but the study of hormones is called endocrinology, and I had, as part of I'm not an endocrinologist, but as part of my training, I had studied that in quite a lot of depth, so I knew what to expect, but it still floored me. It absolutely floored me. I think lots of people think about symptoms being hot flushes, and insomnia, perhaps mood swings.
Turning into a cow overnight.
Yeah. But essentially, what they don't talk about is the anxiety, the brain fog. I've experienced it already this morning, that kind of inability almost to keep a thread of conversation going sometimes because you are, your hormones impact you across your whole body. And I think we think of them as being reproductive health, but actually it's from, our hair right down to our ankle joints. Yeah.
So you experience these dramatic changes, and they can be, there's a whole list. Your book kind of lists all of those. What are the most common ones? And how can women, I suppose, navigate some of these symptoms?
Yeah, so when I was writing the book, which was in 2021, we were talking about 34 symptoms. We now think there's 70 plus. Yeah. And I think essentially anything that women experience during that time, and the average age of perimenopause is kind of 45, but it can affect women a lot earlier. Anything really that they go through can be potentially related to that hormonal chaos that I talked about before. And I think, like I said, the poster symptoms are hot flushes and night sweats, but actually not every woman experiences those. What women will find quite often is the psychological symptoms that I talked about, that kind of fear almost of, lots of women will say that they are scared to drive on the motorway now. If they are they're used to talking at work, maybe presenting, and suddenly they can't stand up, in a boardroom anymore. But also lots of body composition changes, so weight gain, particularly around the middle, hair loss, skin changes, so lots of dryness, maybe some itching. There's vaginal symptoms, and vulval symptoms that people don't really talk about enough. And I think it's really important that there is a solution for all of this, and it isn't always HRT. So, we've kind of the pendulum since 2002, since the Women's Health Initiative has swung, I would say, quite far now into, and it's really helpful for lots of women, but not everybody wants to take hormones. Not everybody can, as we both know. And so I think it's really important, and this was another thrust of the book, was to show women that there are all sorts of ways to solve, this perimenopause and menopause kind of issue. And that could be pharmacological. There's lots of pharmaceutical options that don't involve hormones. I think that isn't talked about enough, particularly things like, vaginal estrogen. That's accessible to lots of women, even women who've had a cancer diagnosis. And there's obviously also nutrition and lifestyle, which is what I talk about a lot. Support, I think networking and finding a community is really important as well. And things like, really boring, those big levers, though, that I think we don't pull as much as we should. Things like de-stressing, things like, prioritising sleep. All of these things are covered in the book.
Yeah, and the prioritising sleep thing is interesting because often sleep problems is one of the symptoms. So it feels like you need to prioritise it, but you can't get it right. So there's a whole range of things to navigate. Now you mentioned that some of the changes that women experience is weight gain or weight shift, and that really can affect a woman's self-esteem, and she might become a little bit more focused on the weight loss than the actual general health, and could lead to miracle cures or fancy fatty diets. What is the danger in these food fads, and how can the ordinary woman kind of navigate her way around this?
I think one of the dangers is that the people pushing these fatty diets probably aren't actually following them themselves, or they are quite extreme. And for your average woman who is navigating teens and, juggling careers and possibly older parents and, stress at work, I think it's not always very practical. So we really need to make the way of eating at this time, it needs to work for women. It needs to be sustainable. There's absolutely no point doing a 6-week body blitz to then, not be able to sustain it and to stop doing it, and then for all of that work to then be undone. So I'm very much about talking long-term health. It's about making small changes, but changes that you can actually do for the rest of your life. So it's an eating pattern rather than a diet. And I think as well, with a lot of these kind of fatty diets, it's all about, and we were talking about this earlier, weren't we? It's all about kind of excluding huge food groups and being very restrictive and feeling very deprived. Whereas actually, life is hard enough. We don't want to be taking out, chocolate and not being able to share birthday cake with our friends and stuff like that. So, we need to make it sensible.
Yeah. And we have a tendency to punish ourselves anyway. So it can be very punishing to do these things. And often that's why they don't work. So you're keen to teach women to keep their symptoms in check through what they eat, actually. And this is a very interesting bit because we also at Breast Cancer UK talk a lot about the benefits of a great, healthy, balanced diet. It can reduce our risk of many diseases, including breast cancer. But what I'd like to know from you is how we can use food to future-proof our bodies. And you address this in your fabulous book. And there's some core principles that you mention, which I think are really worth sharing. There's a lot of information there, so people will need to go to the book to really get the detail. But maybe you can walk us through what those core principles are.
Yes, I'll tell you my favourites too. So I think before we go into that, I think it's important to highlight the fact that your body will change in midlife anyway, and that's okay. I think we have these kind of expectations that we need to look the same as we did when we were 20. Your body will change, and that's totally fine. So don't believe everything that you see on social media. And I think if people are trying to push a certain narrative, or they are very almost hysterical and a bit neurotic about certain ingredients, I would really kind of work towards curating your social media feed so that you're not kind of being exposed to those kind of messages. But I think as well, it's important to point out that there's no special menopause diet, there's no special cancer diet. It really, the principles are the same for preventing and kind of navigating this time of life as they are for, kind of post-diagnosis and post-menopause too. So there are some guiding principles that I like to think about. So there are 7 that I talk about in the book. The first one, I'll start with the first one because I think it's the most important in many respects. There's 2 that I think are worth flagging up. So I talk about powering up on protein because it's really filling. It's really how Wegovy and these kind of Mounjaro, these GLP-1 injections that people are using for weight loss now, in some ways, they are kind of tapping into this satiety, turning on these satiety hormones. So when you eat protein, it fills you up. It is very slow releasing in terms of energy. And so it can be very helpful in terms of managing your weight, but also in staving off the muscle mass loss that we often experience kind of, from almost our mid-30s onwards.
And then it kind of accelerates after menopause, the muscle loss, yeah?
Absolutely, yeah. So, you have to kind of marry it up with weights and resistance training. You won't build muscle just by eating protein, but it is definitely something to have, in the back of our minds. And I think a lot of women aren't eating enough, particularly at breakfast. So if you start your day with a protein-rich breakfast, it can actually really help to stabilise your blood glucose levels throughout the day. And it can help to fill you up and kind of stop that incessant snacking that I see a lot of women doing when I get them to fill in a food diary. And they're kind of grazing throughout the day. And what I'm trying to kind of get people to do is to eat big, really filling, high volume meals, but then having a break in between.
Big break. So what does a high protein breakfast look like?
That's a great question. So on my Instagram, this is all I talk about. I try to aim for about 30 grams of protein, particularly in the morning. So it might be, the beauty is there's lots of different ways you can do it. So it could be Greek yogurt, but a big portion, like 150 grams, 200 grams, not some little kind of paltry amount.
So full fat.
So this is a controversial topic. It depends what your goal is. If you are trying to manage your weight, then 0% fat might be a good option for you, particularly when it comes to authentic Greek yogurt, because it doesn't have any kind of additives, sugars, added sugars, anything like that. And then you can add your fat in, because fat is important, and we'll go into that. You can add your fat in later, in the same kind of meal, in terms of things like nuts and seeds or nut butter, flax seeds, those kind of things. But yeah, you get a lot of bang for your buck with a 0% Greek yogurt. It's pretty low in calories. It's actually higher in protein than full fat. So it's definitely something to consider. But on the flip side, a lot of women will find that a full fat yogurt, so 2% or 5% or even 10%, actually fills them up. So, it might keep them going for longer. I think there's no hard and fast rules when it comes to nutrition. I think we need to kind of play around, and we're all very individual.
Yeah. So important to have a lot of protein. And I think I read somewhere that for some reason, women tend to not have the right intake of protein. So we need to all think about increasing it, yeah?
Yeah, it's kind of, protein is very much, for some reason, it's kind of almost linked with kind of muscle, gym bros and things like that. But actually, yeah, it's definitely something that we all need to be thinking about, but particularly when we are breastfeeding, when we are in that menopause transition, post-60, if we're recovering from any kind of surgery, our needs do increase. So, yeah, Greek yogurt, tofu, things like that. The obvious ones are things like eggs. Eggs on their own, only 6 grams of protein per egg. So if you're having a couple of eggs in your scrambled breakfast, scrambled eggs breakfast, actually you might want to think about adding in. So one of the recipes that I've recently done adds in cottage cheese. And I think a lot of people are like, oh, cottage cheese. But, you mix it in really well, and then you scramble your eggs as normal. And it is totally imperceptible. You wouldn't know it's there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you've bumped it up like an extra 11 grams of protein per 100 grams of cottage cheese. So there's lots of nice little hacks that you can use, to kind of get that protein up.
Yeah. Fabulous. What's one of the other core principles?
Okay, and so my other favourite one is adding in more fibre. So essentially getting in a lot more plants than we are used to. We are guided, by the UK to get in about 30 grams of fibre a day. Currently, we're only getting about 16. And again, it's all those kind of volume foods. So fruit and veg, things like legumes, something that I think we're not particularly good at in the UK at eating. Lentils, chickpeas,
Yeah, they
beans.
all seem to come from other cuisines, not local really.
Yeah, and I think one of the issues with that is when people do eat them, because they're not used to them, they notice that they bloat them, or they can make them really kind of gassy, and that isn't always what people want. So they then kind of avoid them. But actually, what we should be doing is including them, but in much smaller portions, building up our tolerance, because essentially all of that gas is really just your gut microbes, which everyone is talking about at the moment. Yeah, fermenting them down and kind of creating these byproducts. And the more you give them, the more used to them they get, and then you won't notice this bloating so much. So when it comes to fibre, if you are currently eating that 16 grams, but you're trying to then overnight go to 30, you will probably encounter some resistance from those gut microbes. So we all say go low and slow.
And we mention a high fibre diet as well as part of our advice, because there are associations with helping to reduce the risk of breast cancer and other diseases. So, there's the immediate impact as well as the long-term benefits to our health. Yeah.
Well, it taps into what you were talking about future-proofing. When women go through breast cancer, yes, they've got that to deal with, but they've also, all of us need to be thinking about the fact that heart disease is the number one killer of women in the UK. So, we need to make sure that we are looking at our cholesterol, we are eating enough fibre, we're looking at our blood glucose regulation, we're looking at our blood pressure, our weight, all of this kind of taps into that metabolic picture, health picture.
Yeah. What are some of the other core principles?
Okay, so the other ones, I've just talked about it very briefly, but balancing your blood glucose, I think it has... there's a big sort of spotlight with a certain person now who's talking very much about blood glucose spikes. And I think there's perhaps people are becoming a little bit kind of hyper-fixated on them, wearing blood glucose monitors and things like that.
I think, is there more people with diabetes, or is that just a trend?
It's a trend. I have used them in clinic myself, but, they're only really helpful in a certain demographic. People with pre-diabetes, maybe, people with type 2 diabetes, and obviously if you've got type 1, then you will probably be wearing one anyway. But for most of us, we don't need to monitor our blood glucose levels to that degree, but just making sure that you're eating a balanced plate, which has protein, it has complex carbs in it, and it has some healthy fats. By dint of doing that, you will be managing your blood glucose anyway. It just means, reducing the amount of refined carbohydrates, reducing the amount of added sugars, all the things that, the sensible things that we will all talk about anyway. I think as well, if I've said that there isn't really a menopause diet, there isn't a breast cancer diet, but eating like a Mediterranean is a really good guide for all of us to follow. It's anti-inflammatory, and we know that lots of chronic diseases actually start with some kind, or are linked with some kind of inflammatory process. So again, it's going back to the same things. Lots of fruit and veg, ideally seasonal, using olive oil as your primary cooking fat, avocados, legumes, minimal red meat, but you can eat some red meat, and fish and dairy.
Yeah, and not too much alcohol in the Mediterranean diet.
Yes, yes. It's contentious, isn't it? Because, well, it's not even contentious. The new guidelines kind of say that there is no safe limit. So I think it's a really hard one, isn't it? Because I think we want women to live and feel joy, and sometimes that joy is got from sharing, a glass of wine, not one glass, but having a glass of wine with your girlfriend. And that is a really important part of life. So it's about kind of balancing it, I guess. But yeah, there isn't a safe level. And I think if somebody, and I see this a lot, particularly when they're going through menopause, if that's their only source of, their kind of only way to de-stress, it can be an issue. So it's definitely worth brainstorming all the other ways so that you aren't reliant on that nightly glass of wine. Maybe it's just something that you have for special occasions.
Yeah, and I've been talking to other guests about the whole market around the non-alcohol alternatives as well, which is something we talk about. But, the other bit we talked a little bit about earlier on is, yes, we know there's no safe limit now. And when it comes to breast cancer risk and alcohol, there's a clear link between the two. But it is associated with how much you drink, and the more you drink, the more you increase your risk. So, rather than being entirely reductive, it's about finding that balance, isn't it?
It is. And yeah, there are lots of alternatives. I've been using, I'm a huge, I don't always practice what I preach. So there are times when I'm like, oh my God, I need to almost have a bit of a reset, because it's very easy for things like those kind of habits to creep up. So for me, it's gin and tonic is my nemesis. So I've just discovered this kind of switchel. It's like a ginger switchel almost, called Mother Root. And I have been using that. I have that with a tonic, a really nice fever tree tonic. And for me, that really helps.
Wonderful. You're not the first person who's mentioned Mother Root.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So that sounds like a really great alternative. All right. Any more principles you want to share with us, or do you want to send people to read your book, because they really should?
I will definitely read the book, but yeah, just very quickly. We've touched on fats. Healthy fats are really important. I would just say make sure, like I said already, that olive oil is your primary source. But yeah, don't fear nuts and seeds and avocados and oily fish. These are all really, really helpful, really good kind of anti-inflammatory properties. And then the final one I think that is important, and this is something that I am talking about more, is about getting more plants on your plate. So we used to talk about getting your 5 a day. Then we were talking about kind of getting between 8 and 10 portions of fruit and veg a day. And I think for a lot of people that felt quite daunting. We now talk about 30 plus.
Oh gosh, I know, it sounds even more daunting.
Across a week though. So, and I think actually if you were to make a list in your phone of every single different plant food that you consume across that week, you would already be quite close. And we need to remember that it isn't just fruit and veg, it's legumes, it's herbs and spices, it's nuts and seeds. So, it is quite easy actually to hit that threshold. And also, we need to be thinking about variety. So diversity is key, which is why we're always banging on about eating the rainbow. We want lots of colour on our plates. All of those different colours are related to polyphenols, which is these kind of plant chemicals that are found in plant foods, and they confer all these amazing health benefits.
Yeah, and can help to address things like inflammation and hopefully reduce hot flushes and some of those symptoms as well that women experience.
Absolutely. There are a certain type of polyphenol called phytoestrogens that I'm sure you will have, your listeners will have heard of. And they potentially can be said to help with things like hot flushes. So things like soya, there's lots of kind of scaremongering around soya, which is sad, because actually, particularly for plant-based eaters, it could be it's a really good complete protein, and it may confer these benefits when it comes to things like the vasomotor symptoms. So yeah, the body of evidence really says that at worst they are neutral. At best, they may even prevent cancer, recurrence. So it's definitely something to have in the back of your mind. And you will get it from all those soya products. So things like edamame beans, things like tofu, tempeh, and what are the other ones? Oh, and then the kind of the phytoestrogens that aren't soya based are things like flax seeds. So, sprinkle them on. I say a tablespoon of ground flax, which you can buy them whole, really, really cheap. Just grind them up in your NutriBullet or like a little coffee grinder, 1 to 2 tablespoons of those. I mean, huge for amount of phytoestrogens for one thing, but also one of your plants that you can put to your 30, and also a really, really good source of fibre.
On the whole soy discussion, we're aware of that too. And one of the things we do is we provide what we call reviews on our website. So if people want to find out more about this whole controversy and the advice we give around soy, they should go to our website. But you're absolutely right. I think sometimes there's been too much emphasis on some of the scaremongering and not enough focus on the benefits. Now, this book's great because it covers so many things, and you both have different sets of skills, your co-author and you, so, from kind of medical advice through to lifestyle and then diet. But one of the things you talk about, which we also spend a lot of time talking about, is the benefits of physical activity on both our general health, but also for the perimenopausal woman. Now, you opened this chapter by stating a fairly stark thing, and that's the physical inactivity is just behind smoking as a major contributor to ill health. Now, that's pretty worrying. We recognise that too. We devote a lot of our work to promoting regular physical activity because it has the potential to drastically reduce our risk of a whole range of diseases, including breast cancer. But can you explain how exercise, why it's important for women, how it can relieve our symptoms of perimenopause, and then can you talk a bit about some specific exercises as well?
Yeah. So I think that all exercise, all movement is good. It's good for our mental health. Quite often it means that you are doing it with other people, so it's got that community aspect. And I think it encourages women to get out of their minds and into their bodies. And I think sometimes when you have a diagnosis, perhaps you can almost become a little bit disenfranchised from the rest, from your body. And so I think, exercise really ticks so many boxes: relaxation, endorphins, getting outside. It doesn't matter what it is. I think if you really want to kind of hone in on it, though, that one form that can be particularly helpful is resistance training. So building up that muscle. This is obviously not going to be open to everybody at all stages of their journey, but when you can, if you can lift weights, I think that it can be incredibly helpful. We were talking about blood glucose monitors. Actually, the more muscle you have, the better you are. The more insulin sensitive you are, which is a good thing. So it's a really good way of managing your glucose, because basically your muscles act like a sponge and they kind of suck it up. Building that muscle is incredibly important. But so is yoga, so is Pilates, all those kind of more mindful activities, I think, can be really, really helpful.
And it can have a positive impact on our hormones as well. When it comes to breast cancer, it can help for women of all ages, but also in particular older women, it can help regulate our circulating hormones. And we know that particularly when we get older, but at all stages, hormones such as estrogen, even though we don't produce estrogen after the menopause, we can still produce it in some parts of our body, such as fat cells. And exercise can help regulate that and reduce those circulating hormones, which is important.
Well, and it can help to regulate cortisol, which is the hormone. And actually, when your cortisol is high, your estrogen and your sex hormone production is low. So again, it's about managing stress and things like that. So there is always nothing happens in isolation, right? So everything is kind of in your body. Think of hormones particularly as like this kind of symphony, and there's a real kind of interplay between them. So we are giving them the raw ingredients and hoping, that will help them to function to the best of their abilities. And this is something actually that I wanted to touch on previously. I think there is a lot, when we're talking about hormones, there's quite a lot of pseudoscience around things like balancing hormones. And like what I've just said is kind of, it almost sounds a little bit wishy-washy. You give it the raw ingredients and you kind of hope for the best. And really, that is essentially, unless you are adding in thyroxine because you've got, Hashimoto's, for example, or if you're adding in HRT because you're managing menopause symptoms, that is one specific way and a very dose-dependent way that you can manage hormones. But when it comes to food, essentially we're just trying to give our bodies the best ingredients that we can. But there is a sort of certain faction, I think, of social media that are talking about balancing hormones in terms of, seed cycling and things like that. So,
seed cycling?
Yeah,
Can
exactly.
you explain that?
Exactly.
What is
Your
that?
face says it all. So it's, people are saying that you need to eat seeds, certain types of seeds in a certain order throughout your menstrual cycle in order. It's just that level, that kind of detailed ability to manage hormones just doesn't exist through food, unfortunately. If it did, we'd all be doing it, know.
Yeah.
So I think it's very easy for women to get sucked into that and then spend a lot of headspace, working out sunflower seeds in my luteal phase. It's got to be pumpkin seeds, here. Really, we just want to be kind of
There's nothing particularly
de-stressing.
intuitive about living your life, kind of medicating yourself via the foods that you eat. And I suppose you might call that, there's this thing called meno-washing and menosphere, and women are very prone to getting caught up in it. And is this driven by a fear? What's it driven by?
Well, yeah, it's driven by women being very vulnerable at this time. And obviously people, companies are latching onto it and recognising that women, if they're not getting the support that they need, perhaps from their GPs, because they're not trained as effectively, as they could be, then there's this kind of big disparity, this health gap. And so women are quite desperate, I see lots of women who are feeling really, really low because of their symptoms. And therefore, they will be trying these magnets in their pants or, exactly. And a lot of this stuff, it's using up headspace that could be, focused elsewhere, like moving your body, like eating generally pretty well. We don't have to kind of hyper fixate on the minutiae. What I'm trying to get women to do is to kind of pull the big levers, the things that we've already talked about, stress reduction, sleep, community, eating well. And actually, you don't need to be worrying about eating seeds in a certain order, or the fact that, dairy is quote unquote inflammatory, or that there are lectins in beans that are trying to kill you, or seed oils, that are inflammatory. All of this is just, it's taking up too much of women's valuable headspace.
Yeah. And as you say, sometimes when women are feeling really bad, they're thinking, I'm going to find a solution because I need to feel better. And actually, at the beginning of our conversation, you said something interesting, a little piece of advice you said about trying to minimise certain things from appearing in your feed. How else can women cut through all this noise?
Yeah, that's a big one. Honestly, I think there is so much to be said for going through and just, blocking, muting. If it's somebody and you don't want to upset them, mute them. They'll never know. So that you're just not being exposed to those kind of toxic messages. And if somebody, if somebody is popping up in your feed a lot, and they are really didactic and they talk in these kind of blanket terms, or they are hyperfixating on one particular ingredient, I would start to investigate what's in it for them. Are they trying to sell you something? It's usually a supplement. They're usually talking about high ultra processed foods, but then they're trying to sell you some kind of protein powder that's high ultra processed. Not that I've got anything against protein powder. It can be really helpful, but a lot of the time they are selling you a protocol or it's quite often a supplement. And really, the evidence behind supplements is really quite sketchy. What are the other ways? Looking at people's qualifications, making sure that what they're saying is nuanced, I think that's really important. And sometimes those people don't get the big followers or the big audience because it's just not sexy and it's not kind of clickbaity enough.
That's
sadly.
a real, look, not to downplay those, those science-backed advisors who are really popular on, some people are popular and they provide really great advice. But I think that is a telltale, isn't it? If someone is good at the clickbait, then maybe they've kind of gone down, the line of potentially kind of selling something that people want to hear rather than actually providing that advice that mightn't be as sexy.
Yeah, there are some really good people. So let's pick out some good people to kind of focus on. Liz O'Riordan is a great one. She is a breast cancer surgeon. You'll know her, I'm sure, who has had breast cancer. She's written a couple of books. She's got a new one out. Anis Mukherjee is amazing. You know, she talks in this very broad way. You know, she gives lots of different solutions. There isn't just one avenue. Who is another one? Those are the two that kind of spring to mind. Oh, Susan Davis, who's Australian and doing lots of work on things like HRT.
Yeah.
So she's just joined Instagram. So she doesn't have a huge platform, but she is doing amazing research behind the scenes.
Yeah. And of course, as yourself, and you're very passionate about education. And I think you say that's the first thing is education. And then it's kind of understanding what to do with that education. So how do you feel that education plays a role in helping women take charge of their health?
Well, it gives them a toolkit from which to pick and choose, because there isn't, we're very much talking about personalised nutrition these days. There isn't just one way, though, of doing something. I think, you know, unfortunately, there is a little bit of trial and error. And I think that kind of puts women off sometimes. So, you know, if you can work with a healthcare professional that you trust, then brilliant. They can help you to kind of navigate through, you know, the kind of confusing world sometimes. But yeah, having lots of, feeling like you've got a lot of tools at your disposal, I think is really reassuring, rather than thinking I've got to do this really restrictive carnivore diet because, you know, so-and-so says it's the only way. Yeah. Education is power. And I think for women, whether it's going into, you know, menopause or whether it is dealing with kind of post-surgery, whatever it is, it's like you want to feel that you've got a lot of solutions at your disposal. There isn't just one way. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think being able to adapt something that works for you and your lifestyle as well is so important. And often going down some very strict diet, which I suppose we've been programmed to think about, it completely overturns our life, and that's often why it doesn't work, you know.
Yeah, you can't, you know, squish your way of eating into somebody else's pattern. There has to be a certain amount of kind of give and take. Yeah, for sure. Also, you know, I think it's worth pointing out that you can't overhaul your diet overnight or your lifestyle. So try and pick, you know, prioritise, pick the top two things. It might be, we were talking about protein, it might just be having 30 grams of protein at breakfast. And that's all you do.
Yeah.
You know, you don't have to do it for breakfast, lunch and dinner. Start small and then build up.
Those small changes are the way that real change can happen. And you know, we provide the same kind of advice. When it comes to diet, nutrition, it's not about taking anything away. It's about, as you say, making that small change, getting used to that small change, and then maybe adding another small change. And then eventually you'll kind of like it and hopefully stick with it.
Yeah.
Anyway, people who are listening can get a lot more from your book. And so this brings us to the part of our show where we ask our guests the same question. And it's one that I think you kind of tapped into very early on, but you might have another one. And that's, do you have a guilty pleasure? Or what's your biggest guilty pleasure?
Okay, so I won't talk about alcohol.
Yeah. Tick that one.
My guilty pleasure, so it's a pleasure, I try not to think about it in a guilty way, is Booja Booja. Do you know what Booja Booja is? It's these amazing truffly chocolates.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the guilty bit, I guess, is the fact that they are so like eye-wateringly expensive. But yeah, they are definitely something that I try to include in my diet. So I will always have some dark chocolate, you know, somewhere throughout the day. I would have that daily. And I really want women to kind of take away this notion that everything is on the table when it comes to nutrition, you know, within reason. And that by trying to exclude things wholly, you know, I often hear women say, oh my God, you know, I'm going to take out all sugar, or I'm going to stop doing this. It just makes you kind of hyperfixate on those things.
And a bit miserable.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
A little bit of what you fancy is good for you.
Yeah, that's right. Because there's a benefit to feeling good about something after you've eaten it as well, isn't there? Makes you a happier person.
Absolutely.
If you can allow yourself that a little bit. So what about recommendations? You started talking to us about some of the Instagram people that you follow, but do you have any books or podcasts or even films that you'd like to recommend, even if they're not related to your specific advice?
Yeah, so since COVID, I've become a huge advocate of walking. We didn't talk about that actually, but it's
Walking
part of
is
movement,
one of those
right?
movements, yeah.
And it's accessible to pretty much everyone.
Yeah.
And so it is now something that I have to do it every day. It's one of my non-negotiables. I try and aim for 10,000 steps. Doesn't matter if you can't do that. 10,000 is an arbitrary number, but it's just something that I like to do. So I do a lot of podcast listening while I'm doing my walks and listening to audiobooks as well. Just trying to it's a really good way for me to decompress if I'm having quite a full-on time with my kids or work or, relationships. So one of my favourite, I've got lots, but one of my favourites, it has absolutely nothing to do with what we've been talking about, is How to Fail by Elizabeth Day.
Right.
So she tends to talk to stars, celebrities, about things that they've done in their life which haven't worked out how they wanted to. And it's really good because it makes you realise that you don't have to be perfect and that you can kind of learn from these so-called failures. I really recommend it. It's great.
Well, it's great if it'll get someone out walking.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And that's a great thing about podcasts. I've found that since podcasts started, it's one thing listening to music, it's great. But since I started listening to podcasts, I'm often out because I just want to listen to the next episode and it's the only time I can do it.
You get really excited. This this links to what we were talking about previously about social media. Podcasts also can be they can be quite toxic. They can be quite confusing. So I think there's a lot of big podcasts with who have had, so-called experts on who maybe aren't giving out the best advice. So you have to, I think, as well, pick and choose your podcasts.
You do, yeah, because some of them can be very entertaining, but not necessarily accurate. Yeah,
and the podcast host, really, it's down to them to be monitoring who they have on, and I don't think that is currently happening, right?
No, but it is really exploding, isn't it? So yeah, great podcast. So remind us the name of that podcast.
How to Fail.
How to Fail.
And if you want a really good balanced nutrition, but these are long form podcasts, so they are, you'll really be getting into the kind of nuts and bolts. Simon Hill, who's Australian, he has one called The Proof, which is superb, I think.
Okay, great, fantastic. What about yourself? What are your plans for the future? Have you got anything you want to share with us that you're planning, anything on your bucket list that you'd like to achieve?
So my next big kind of work achievement is the 30-gram plan, which is my next book, my second book. I have a copy here. I'm just flashing it to Thalie. It goes into a lot of what we've been talking about, but in a lot more detail. So it's called the 30-gram plan because it centres around 30 grams of protein per meal, 30 grams of fibre a day, and 30 different plants a week.
Right.
So I talk about the science at the beginning. It's very all in kind of layman's terms, so it's very accessible. And then I've given people 80, I think there's over 80 in the end, 80 plus recipes, which actually put all of that research onto your plate, because I think it can be quite confusing for people.
Yeah, it can be. But if it's all there, I mean, I myself, I love cooking, but I don't know how to cook without a recipe. So when I get offered recipes, I love it because then I know that I'm gonna have what I need.
This is very simple. I'm just going to say I am no chef. So these are very, very simple recipes. They are very accessible. Nothing fancy, no kind of far-flung exotic ingredients. But yeah, essentially, I just wanted to take the research and put it onto people's plates.
Brilliant. Great. And where can our listeners find out more about you? You've got a couple of books, but where else can they find you?
Yeah, so mostly I hang out on Instagram, which is at emma.bardwell, and there's lots of free recipes on there that you can tap into, or you can get me via my website, which is emmabardwell.com.
Brilliant. And I saw your seed bread on there, actually, and I'm going to definitely give that a go. Loads of flax.
People
loads
love
of other
that.
things.
Yeah, loads of fibre. People love that. And the other one, which is loads of protein, is the cottage cheese bread.
Yes.
Get involved with that as well.
I love cottage cheese. I'm going to give... I think you were saying, a lot of people are a bit underwhelmed by it, but I love cottage cheese.
It's amazing. It's a great ingredient. It's having a resurgence too, which I'm really happy about.
Thanks so much for your time, Emma. It's been brilliant having you.
It's lovely to see you.